Hi, folks. Welcome to episode 45. Episode 45 is not another episode, it's the last episode of the year. Of course, there is more to come in 2025, but we need to come to a closure, and that's what we are going to do this episode over the next hour. And for that purpose, I have a fantastic guest. His name is Tibor Fischer. He is British, although his family is Hungarian. So we explore both parts of his history. Let's call it that way. So one is the British, another one is the Hungarian. It's nothing new in this podcast. You know, I'm very much into Hungary myself. I lived in Budapest for nearly 4 years. My girlfriend is from a Hungarian ethnicity, so I'm quite close to Hungary myself. And I have other links, as you may gather, but we'll explore that. Also, he is an author. He's quite reputed in England, and not only in England, also in the US and some other parts of the English-speaking world. He's translated into many languages. So I think he's someone very interesting to talk to. So before I welcome Tibor to this platform, I will invite you again. I know I said it plenty of times, but it's part of being a content creator. If you can subscribe to my channel, I'll be delighted. If you can convince someone to subscribe, I'll be the same delighted. Also, if you enjoy these straightforward and down-to-earth conversations, give us a thumbs up. That's how these things get distributed. And if you can share with others, people who would benefit from this kind of conversations, I'll be more than happy. So let's bring Tibor to the show, and we'll have a chat here. Tibor, how are you?
Ready for the first question?
What's that? Sorry?
Ready for the first question.
Ready for the first question. I like that. So you mentioned while we were preparing this podcast that you will be recording from Hungary. So I want to ask you, how is it to be in Hungary these days? Because you are not exactly an outsider, although you were born in Britain, your family is Hungarian. So how does it feel to be in Hungary in your shoes?
Very comfortable. I like Budapest a lot. It's a great city. The weather most of the year is a lot better than London. It's a little bit cheaper than London. I mean, in many ways, Budapest is the perfect size for a city. It's big enough to have everything, but it's more manageable than London. I find London now very hard work. I to and fro between London and Budapest, and I'm usually more at peace in Budapest now than in London, where you have to wake up in the morning and check who's on strike and which bits of public transport are working, etc., etc.
Yeah, one of the things that I was very happy with when I live in Budapest is one thing you just mentioned is the public transport. With this 4 and 6, for people who don't know, is a tram line which covers, I'd say, most of the city center and some other parts not far from the core of Budapest. It's 24 hours, so you can get anywhere you want pretty easily, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I mean the public transport is very good. I mean, perhaps comparing it with London isn't a fair comparison because London is such a much bigger city, but the public transport here is very good. In the evenings, it's not so good. I mean, if you love nightlife, then the public transport, you spend a lot of time waiting at the tram stop late at night, but it's very good, and it's sort of cleaner and more organized than London. I mean, I now find it almost impossible to make a journey on the tube because I live very centrally in London, so I always use public transport. And it's very hard to make a journey into London and back without, a beggar, a nutcase, a drunk, someone just very annoying. Okay, you do get a drunk and a lunatic occasionally, or a beggar on Budapest public transport. But it's much better. People behave much more, much more orderly and considerate way. Again, perhaps because Budapest is a smaller city, so that there isn't the same sort of degree of alienation that you can get in London.
Yeah, I will subscribe all that. Do you feel home in Hungary, or how would you describe your feelings when you are there?
Well, as you said, I mean, my parents left Hungary in 1956 after the revolution and went to the UK, where I was born and where I grew up. But all the rest of the family, everyone else stayed behind. So I still have, many relatives here, many cousins. I get lots of very good free meals. As I say, I think Budapest is just a very enjoyable city to live in, generally speaking. I mean, most people who come here and visit, particularly now that the city has been, tarted up. I mean, I first came to Hungary in 1982, and the centre of town was still riddled with bullet holes, either from the Second World War or from the revolution of 1956. The castle area was mostly a pile of rubble when I first came in 1982. That's been completely renovated. It looks fantastic. The Prime Minister's office is there now up on the castle. The centre of the city looks very good. I mean, if you look very hard in some of the back streets, in the sort of quieter parts of Budapest, you can still find the occasional bullet hole or sort of damage from, a tank shell, but it's been beautified to a great extent. And as I say, it's just a very, very pleasant place to live. It's a very cosmopolitan city. You can do anything you want. There are very good bookshops, very good restaurants, a great music scene. I mean, if you enjoy music, there's a lot going on here. A lot of leading, musicians come to perform here. And then you have the Liszt Academy, which has all sorts of concerts with, incredibly talented young musicians. So, and also if you happen to be, a non-Hungarian, you'll probably find the ticket prices very, very agreeable. So, as I say, again, when I first came in sort of 1982, the people on the plane were usually people like me who had some sort of connection with Hungary or were doing some sort of business maybe with Hungary. Now it's full of people coming for a weekend break, 1 week, because it's a great tourist destination, which occasionally has a downside. I mean, we did have the sort of stag party people too.
Yeah.
But people, I don't think I've ever met anyone who came to Budapest and said, "Oh, I didn't really like it. I'm never going back."
Yeah, that's true. I never thought of that. Like all the comments I heard about Budapest, it's positive, which is kind of fishy. How come there is a consensus in humanity, especially these days? But we'll get to that in a second. I'm also conscious that I think there's a big gap, that's my personal opinion, between Budapest and Hungary. Like in other countries, it's not like that. Let's say Spain, there is Madrid, Barcelona, Sevilla, there's a few big cities. And Hungary is not like that. There's a bit of Budapest and Hungary. So are you connected to Budapest or Hungary?
Everyone in the family is Budapest based, on both sides of my family. And you're right. I mean, Budapest is sort of top heavy in a way that many other countries aren't. I mean, again, I'd say that's changed a little bit in the last couple of decades. And both Debrecen and Szeged have sort of great claims to culture and history and make them quite loudly. Miskolc, which is not a very attractive industrial city, is a place I've been to many times, and I have many friends from Miskolc, and they're very proud. I mean, they're very proud of their city, even though, and that's also been tarted up a great deal in the last 20 years. I mean, I filmed there as a journalist in the 1980s, and it was a sort of steel plant city in sort of industrial decline, and that's changed a lot. One of the possible reasons why perhaps the bits of Hungary outside of Budapest have flourished is because of the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who is a country boy, who was never really part of the Budapest elite, the Budapest intellectuals, the Budapest power base. And he's spent a lot of time and money boosting the provinces. I mean, there are, for instance, theatre. I mean, there's a lot of culture that now goes on outside of Hungary, outside of Budapest. I mean, one of the things that people outside of Hungary probably don't appreciate is how good the theatre scene is here. There's a very, very strong theatre tradition here. Some really excellent productions, and a lot of them take place outside of Budapest because the small theatres regional theatres get money to support them. That the balance of power has changed a little bit, but nevertheless, I mean, Budapest is the big power in Hungary, and always will be, I suspect.
Yeah, and it's great that Orban is doing that effort. He's looking after the places that they tend to be neglected by the governments, because, as you said, like most big politicians, they are part of the elite, so they focus their attention there. Also because they get more stuff back from the elite. And Orban is not like that. And there are also guys like Orban who are not exactly from the capital, but from so-called countryside. But the moment they get into government, they start to act out like they are part of the elite, because they are fools. That's the case here in Ireland. We had a prime minister who is from Cork, which is like the second city here, and he acts out like he's a dub, which is a sign of being a complete idiot. And Orban is not like that. I think he is keeping an eye on everyone. And of course, that upsets the opposition, because most of the opposition, I think they are like capital based. Although I know it changed, like with the last election, they came up with this puppet from the south. But still, it's a very much elite intellectual crowd, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the generalization, but it's true that the sort of strongest support for the opposition is in Budapest. And the opposition would criticize Orbán precisely because he is funneling money to the countryside, because they say that's where the voters come from. I mean, nearly all right-wing parties, from America to everywhere else, tend to be criticized on the basis that their support comes from sort of redneck simpletons in the countryside who don't know what they're doing. I mean, one of the ironies is that nearly everyone in Budapest who sort of is a serious political figure, nearly everyone comes from outside. I mean, there seems to be a certain softness to people who grow up in Budapest, maybe because they are growing up as part of the elite. It's nearly always the outsiders. I mean, the big figure in the opposition is Gyurcsány. And again, like Orbán, he's a boy from the outside. The sort of hard men in Hungarian politics and history either come from Transylvania or outside of Budapest. I can't offhand think of some very tough guy who grew up in Budapest. I mean, there must be some, but
is the Budapest mayor from Budapest or not? I can't remember now. Is the Budapest mayor from Budapest?
I think he is. Yes. I mean, Karácsony. I think I may be wrong because I've never paid a great deal of attention to his background, so perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't think so. In any case, he's not really. I would say at the moment, anyway, such a major figure. I mean, it's still in the opposition. It's still Gyurcsány, although even within the opposition, he's very much disliked. But he's still the big power figure for the moment. Then, of course, the newcomer, the shiny new toy in Hungarian politics is Mr. Magyar, who was part of the sort of Fidesz elite, who was married to the former minister for justice, who's now who's gone rogue, run off on his own, and is a very photogenic, very sort of a very good speaker. And he's had incredible success in a very short time, a sort of blitzkrieg campaign out of nowhere, and has a number of MPs, in the European Parliament. His new party, the Tisza party, has a number of MEPs in the European Parliament, although they still don't have a single MP in the Hungarian Parliament. And interestingly enough, there's going to be a by-election early next year, I think January or February, where a former Fidesz MP died, so there has to be a by-election. And they've seen, at the moment anyway, they seem to have chickened out of running because it's a very strong Fidesz seat. So I suppose they're afraid of being defeated. But finally, if you want to win power, you do have to get into the fight. As they say with the national lottery, you've got to be in it to win it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way around. Let's go back to the time. I think you lived in Budapest for a couple of years in the late 80s. So that was prior to the end of the regime. I don't know, maybe the couple, yeah, maybe 3-4 years before. I can't remember now when the regime came to an end. How was the atmosphere when you lived there?
Well, I mean, I came to Hungary for the first time in '82 when I was 22, just after I graduated from university, because my father in particular was in very bad odor with the authorities, I mean, both my parents left with the attitude that we've left, we're not going back. We're very happy in England, but I came back in '82 to visit relatives. Hungary at that point was famously the sort of happiest barracks in the Soviet bloc. Hungarians always managed to feed themselves very well. There was plenty of food. Every few years you were allowed out to travel. And certainly in '82, and then I started working as a journalist. Because people thought because I had a Hungarian name and background, I must know about Hungary, although at the beginning I didn't really know much about the country. But I started coming back. And in '86, I made a documentary for the 30th anniversary of the 1956 revolution and, got in touch with a lot of the Hungarian opposition while we were here filming. And the system seemed perfectly safe. As I say, people weren't delighted with the system. They realized they were behind the rest of Western Europe because Hungary's right next to Austria. Nearly everyone Hungarian has a relative somewhere in Europe or the United States. So they were aware that, things could be a lot better. But at the same time, as long as by this point, the Kádár regime had sort of realized that, you don't have to love the system. As long as you're not actually causing trouble, we don't really care what you do. And the dissident, there was the sort of so-called samizdat press and some dissident organized. Hungarians don't like the term dissident because it's related to a verb which means to leave the country. But the democratic opposition was a very small group of intellectuals in Budapest. I mean, we're talking about, at most 200 people, if that. And the regime didn't mind going about publishing their sort of sociological studies because they knew most people had absolutely no interest in what they were doing. So at that point, by the mid-'80s, it seemed that the system could, and one of my uncles said to me, well, there'll have to be a generational change before the system changes in sort of '86. And in a way, he was right, but the generational change came much sooner than I think he thought it would. And the story I always tell is that in the winter of '87, I was going through the New Gotti railway station concourse, and I saw a guy with at this point there were people sort of setting up little stalls to sell stuff very often, sort of pop up, things before the police turned up. And I saw there was a sort of crowd around this guy. And as I got closer, I could see that he was selling some sort of color magazine. And when I finally got close enough to see what he was selling, I could see that it was a sex manual with extremely sort of, graphic pictures of people having sexual intercourse. And I remember thinking, this guy is standing in a public place, selling things, privately, capitalistically, flogging stuff, of sex manuals, and the communist regime was always very Puritan. They didn't like that sort of stuff. And I thought, things are starting to change here. So I decided to sort of come and spend the next year in Hungary in '88. And that was when everything had just started to fall apart. It was very much linked to the fact that János Kádár, who'd been put into power by the Soviets in 1956, and who presided over the execution of, hundreds of Hungarians who wanted democracy, by this point was senile. And the younger people in the Communist Party, who tried to get rid of him a few years earlier and failed because he was still, strong enough to deal with them, got rid of him. And so that a new generation had taken over. And the younger communists, people who'd traveled abroad, been educated abroad, worked in trade missions, worked in embassies, knew perfectly well Hungary was a long way behind the rest of Europe. They knew perfectly well that the Soviet Union wasn't the answer to their problems. So they tried to sort of ease things up in all sorts of, at first small ways. For instance, the revolution of 1956, which had always been officially described as a counter-revolution, run by fascists and Jesuits, suddenly wasn't. It was a regrettable event because there had been, genuine grievances, blah, blah, blah. And then you started seeing people appear on Hungarian television and radio, members of the democratic opposition, just suddenly came out of nowhere and were starting to talk. And the Communist Party sort of rebranded itself. I have to say, a lot of the leaders of the Communist Party at that time were very, very clever, very, very astute. And for instance, they got rid of the Stalinists, hardliners, by recreating a new party and saying, you have to come and join us. And of course, the Stalinists didn't want to join the new party, so they got rid of them that way. And they were sort of bending over backwards to make mates with the sort of Germans and the Americans and what have you. And that's what led. And then you had the creation of Fidesz, which absolutely terrified people at the time. That the students, and these were the elite students who created Fidesz. These were the sort of creme de la creme who went to a thing called the Bibor István Szakollégium, which meant that you were incredibly smart, incredibly gifted, and they were the ones largely behind Fidesz, Orbán, and many of the others, because this was suddenly a new. Because there was also a thing called the MDF, Magyar Demokrata Forum, but they were terribly. They were a forum. They call themselves a forum. We're not a political party. You mustn't think we're a political party. We're not trying to, undermine the system. We're just discussing various things. Whereas Fidesz set up an independent student body. And this is, the start of 1956, the start of the 1956 revolution was very much linked to student activity. So people were, older people were sort of, fainting at the prospect of what this could mean. And it has to be said, the students who set up Fidesz were taking a huge gamble in 1988, because it wasn't entirely clear how things would go at that point. They wouldn't have been executed or sent to Siberia, but if things had gone a different way, their careers would have been over. And these are, say, the most gifted people. These were the rising stars of Hungarian sort of intellectual life. And Fidesz was also the most active and aggressive organization in going for the Communist Party. And then it sort of became a race towards democracy, because the communists knew that things would have to change, and they actually the irony is they actually wanted proper elections, because they were convinced they would win. Because the democratic opposition were a bunch of sort of beardy sociologists and largely impractical people. And they thought, we're more professional, we have the resources, of course we're going to win the elections. And they rather overlooked the fact that for 45 years people had hated their guts. So in the end they lost the elections. But then they sort of because the first democratic government in Hungary in sort of 1990 was essentially a sort of kamikaze government. They had problems that were impossible to deal with. There was a huge foreign debt. There's actually a sort of conspiracy theory that some of Kardar's economic advisors deliberately borrowed too much money from Western banks to sink the system, because they knew sooner or later that would destroy the Hungarian economy and bring it down. So the first democratic government couldn't really win. With hindsight, maybe they could have done some things better, but that's true of every government. And so then the sort of reformed communists managed to come back and regain power. So that's the sort of history of the change of the system.
So it seems that the Hungarian students were very brave. There's a lot of courage.
They were risking their careers, because if it had gone the other way, they would have ended up, working, I don't know, in a sort of shoe factory in the provinces or something. It didn't, because most of the current, many of the Fidesz people went on to, big careers in politics and elsewhere. But at the time, no one knew that. You couldn't be sure about that. So
Yeah.
they were quite brave in setting up Fidesz.
So if I compare those guys to the current university crowd, especially on the West, it's like night and day. And what I find astonishing myself is the way that the university students, say in the UK, in the US, but mostly in the English-speaking countries, here in Ireland, how they flirt with communism, and they seem to have no clue what they are talking about. So I'll be very curious in getting your thoughts as someone who could see it yourself while you are based in London.
I mean, this is the irony. I mean, I find it, you only have to look at the history of the 20th century to see that, communism never worked anywhere. I mean, there are always people on the left who are saying, well, that wasn't real communism, it wasn't applied properly. No, I mean, it was tried in all sorts of places and failed clearly, verifiably. But I mean, one of the problems with students, the British education system is a disaster. I mean, I've taught in universities, and it's not just they don't know about history; they almost know nothing about anything, because this is a process I've seen. I mean, it started in my youth that they created the comprehensive schools where everyone of all sorts of abilities were thrown together. So I was when I was 11, I was taking a copy of 1984 to read, in sort of lunch breaks or whatever. And I was in the same class as people who were genuinely illiterate, who couldn't write a sentence. So not good for me, not good for them. And the whole process since the 70s has been trying to make it easier for everyone to get through. Particularly, under Blair, there's this obsession with getting more people to university, as if a university degree would guarantee you, champagne would be flowing from your taps. I mean, even when I graduated, I knew people who had degrees who ended up selling double glazing. Even then, a degree wasn't a guarantee of, a sort of material success. And when you sort of, quadruple whatever the number of people going to university, the basic qualification means very little. So there's a whole generation or a couple of generations have been missold university on the basis that you go to university, your life will be great afterwards. Well, not true. Most of those kids are ending up doing the sort of menial clerical jobs that you would have got, 20 years earlier without a degree. So, and everything is, there has been a change. I think a lot of people never would have thought about going to university now do, which is, a good thing, but it's been done at the expense of making a university degree almost worthless, certainly in the arts. I taught English literature and creative writing. Again, and I'm really not joking about this. There were students at university doing English literature who were illiterate, who could not write a correct sentence in English. There'd either be a problem with the spelling or the grammar, or it would be some sort of nonsense sentence like, these differences show there are differences. That was a very small number of students. That was, I don't know, let's say 1%, but they're still there at university, functionally illiterate, because the whole system is like a roll call. If you turn up to school, you'll get your A levels, you'll pass, you'll go to university. Then there's also quite a larger sort of group of students who, let's say 15, 20%, who are almost functionally illiterate, who have no interest in the subject. This is probably one of the drawbacks of English literature, that it's a sort of default subject for people who don't really know what they want to do or who don't want to work, because you can always watch the DVD of Pride and Prejudice or Great Expectations, and it's in English, so you don't have to learn a foreign language or really any sort of much in the way of background information. You can always talk about sexism and slavery and the patriarchy and what have you, and you get through. So there were people I was teaching English literature to who would not have even been allowed to sit the A-level exam in my day, because the teachers would have known they would have had no hope of passing. So they learn a lot of the kids learn nothing practically while they're at university. I mean, I'd say in a lot of places the sort of English literature degree was basically the equivalent of the A-level ISAT in the 1970s. I mean, I asked the kids, what did you do for A-level? And they say they refer to 2 books, something like The Crucible, a novel, something you could probably read, in a day if you can read. I mean, in my day, there were at least 10 texts that we studied, one of which was Vanity Fair, which is, sort of 600 pages, plus a couple of Shakespeare's, plus a Ben Jonson play, plus Chaucer, in the original. The standards have absolutely plummeted. So, as I say, most of the kids don't really learn anything in the 3 years they're there. And then the degree is almost worthless in terms of employment. Plus, they have a huge debt because they pay for it now. So they leave, with debts of 30,000, 40,000 pounds, which they can't pay or won't pay because then they go off and, disappear and do other things. So it's just a sort of lose-lose situation for everyone.
Okay, let me focus now on your personal path. So how did you get into writing, like in composing novels and that kind of stuff?
Well, I think like most writers, it started, I enjoyed reading, I like to read. It's one of those things, if you enjoy reading, you think, oh, maybe I could have a go. And I was always interested in writing. I did stuff at university and then attempted various there were lots of aborted sort of quarter finished projects. And it was after, as I say, I was based in Budapest from sort of 88 to 90 for the big change of the system. And after the first, free elections, I thought, well, that was a fascinating experience, but the big story's over now. And I went back to London. I'd always been working as a freelance. And for various reasons, it was a very bad time to be a freelance, and I just couldn't get any work. And I thought, well, I'm now sort of 30. If I don't really sort of knuckle down now and write a proper novel, and give it 100% and try and get it published. Because I also said I tried to write a book about the change of system and approach publishers and agents, and that didn't get anywhere. So I thought, okay, I was lucky I had some money saved up, so I could, survive. And I just knuckled down and wrote the first novel, which was Under the Frog, which is, I didn't write it because it was, family history. I wrote it because, a lot of people in the Anglo-Saxon world didn't really know about the revolution of 1956. And even a lot of the people who were sort of older at the time and sort of remembered the news about the revolution didn't really know the story or the full story. So I wanted to write about the Hungarian Revolution, and in order to write about the revolution, you had to explain about the Russians turning up. So it starts with the end of the Second World War and goes to the revolution of 1956, when both my parents left. What you do when you have a novel is, you send it to agents because it's almost impossible to get in without an agent. So I started sending it to agents, and I don't know, a dozen or so turned them down. And as I said, I tried to write a non-fiction book about the changes of the system, and approached again, I don't know, 20 agents, both in the United States and in Britain, and got, almost nowhere. So by this point, I was a little, I should say, unhappy with, the agents of this world. And I thought, right, I'll just send it to publishers direct myself, which might have been a mistake. But anyway, I started sending the novel to people, to publishers. I got one or two nice letters that, yeah, it's not bad, but, not for us. And because as I say, with the non-fiction book, I sort of gave up after, a certain number. I thought, this time, there's a thing called the Writers and Artists Handbook, which lists all the imprints in the United Kingdom. And I said to myself, I'm going to go through this book to every single imprint in the UK. And then, if at the end no one's taken it, at least I can say to myself, I tried absolutely everyone. So I started sending it out, and I think there were about 58 imprints working at the time. And, by the time I got to number 55, rejecting it, I didn't think it was going to get published. I was already planning the next book because it just didn't look as if it was going to happen. I ended up sending it to a very, very small Scottish publishing house. And it's very strange, some of the things you remember, because I remember standing there, in these days it was expensive to send out a book because, you had a paper manuscript and you had to post it. So there was a sort of added penalty. And I was standing there with the manuscript and the envelope. And I was thinking, why am I sending it to these people? I mean, they publish stuff about walking in Scotland and very sort of avant-garde books. They're not going to be I thought, okay, we're going to try every once. So I put it in the post. And this very small Scottish publishing company called Polygon, were based in Edinburgh. It was literally one woman on the sort of third floor of the Edinburgh University Press building who ran this imprint. And they liked it and they published it. And then my luck changed because Under the Frog, the Granta magazine, the big literary magazine in the English-speaking world, have a sort of best of young British novelists selection every 10 years. And I managed to get on it. I was very lucky. And then again, I was shortlisted for the Booker. I was lucky to get that. And that changed everything. The book did very, very well then. So, I mean, it was hard to sell because it's about a basketball team in the 1950s, which is not very obviously commercial prospect. But then on the other hand, once it was published, there wasn't much competition in the sort of 1950s basketball scene. So it did well. So that's how I sort of, ended up becoming a novelist.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your book titles. Actually, all of them are quite original, like the Under the Frog. I'm just reading a few here. Under the Frog, The Fourth King, The Collector, Good to be God, How to Rule the Road. Just naming a few. Don't read this book if you are stupid, which was published in the US, like I Like Being Killed. How do you come to these titles? Is it prior the book creation or is throughout the process?
So the sort of title comes along. I mean, when you start working on a book, you never, or at least I don't really know where it's going to go. I think a lot of writers write the book to find out what the book is going to be about. It varies there. I think genre writers tend to work to a formula and have a sort of blueprint that they adhere to. I think in literary fiction, it's a slightly different game. So when I start writing, I never know exactly how it's going to turn out. And it's only really at the end, I think, oh, that's what the book was about then. Eventually a title comes along. Fairly early on, I sort of think, that sounds like a good title. And somehow that sort of helps me focus on the book. I think coming up with a title is part of the game. So
one of my friends, he's also a British author. His name is Craig Powell. He was in this show. It was episode number 2, if I recall well. And he always gives me this advice. Like, it's very hard for us males to be a novelist these days because most of the readers are women. So unless you are a woke author, which is not our case, it's a tough job to deliver stories because on the other side of the table, who are reading are women. So what would be your advice, let's say, for a young writer who is not really, into these topics of gender and Black Lives Matter and all that crap?
It has to be said that getting into the business was never easy. The publishing world isn't falling over themselves to pick up your book. Whether you're a man or a woman or whatever your background is, it's always difficult. It's always been difficult to get in. I think one of the things that has changed for the worse is that, again, I call the end of the golden era. I think in that, in the 80s and 90s, still publishers had a sense that it would probably take you 2, 3, 4 books probably to establish a reputation and a readership, and that's all gone now. If your first book doesn't really take off, you're toast. Whoever you are, whether you're male, female, trans, live in Glasgow, live in a tent, it doesn't matter. You're now because with the electronic point of sale, no matter how nice the reviews are, no matter how, whether you win some of the minor awards, everyone knows exactly how many copies you've sold, and if you sold sort of 300 copies, people aren't going to be very interested in your next book. It's very tough in that regard. But that's got worse, I think. It's also got worse that, as I say, I teach, creative writing students, 19, 20-year-olds, and they read almost nothing. And to be fair to them, part of it is that, when I was growing up, no internet, 3 television channels. So one of the reasons I read a lot was because there wasn't much else in the way to do in the cold, dark evenings. And now if I were growing up now, I'd be playing computer games and doing other things and reading less. So I think the market has sort of got smaller. I mean, there is admittedly now the TikTok phenomenon, which, as a writer, I'm delighted to see. Although I do wonder how many of the people who sort of talk about, a book have actually read it, because, it's quite easy just to sort of wave the book around and pretend you've read it, as many of my students I know have done. So that's the downside. And as you say, both the readership and the business are now dominated by women. Again, maybe it was very male dominated when I started. Not now. Look at the literary agencies, look at the publishing houses. It's the ladies who are in charge. And it's not unreasonable because, most of for instance, the book clubs, if, you go along, there aren't many guys there. It is, very much dominated by women. So not so, fair enough. So yeah, if you happen to be, a gentleman, not easy to break in. And there's also an additional problem that, creative writing courses, which barely existed when I started. I mean, nearly every university has some sort of creative writing course. And the result of that is a lot of people who probably wouldn't have had the discipline to finish a book now get enough of a shove and support to actually finish a manuscript, to come up with a decent manuscript. So there's also a problem. There are a lot of sort of maybe not brilliant books knocking around because they're always few and far between, but there are sort of lots of reasonable manuscripts that are sort of floating around, which makes it even harder to find an agent or a publisher. I mean, I've had some quite talented students who spent years, literally years, trying to find an agent. And I would say now it's even, I mean, when I sort of started sending the book myself, I think it was still just possible to sort of catch an editor and be lucky and get published. The publishers now just, won't deal with you if you don't have an agent. They just, can't be bothered, which in some way I think is a poor reflection on them. But, life is short, you don't want to read sort of, 60 novels in a weekend. So the agents filter it out for them. And also, I mean, I would also add that writing, I think these days is not really, writing a novel is not a get-rich-quick scheme. If you want to make money writing now, your sort of last hope really is writing for TV or film. Although, of course, there's also now the danger of AI, because, that's going to eat up a lot of the work that used to exist in television and film. They'll still have writers, but I guarantee you AI, will be doing a lot of the basic work in that field. So there'll be less work for writers, full stop. So not a very sunny prospect, I'm afraid. I wish I could be, a little more optimistic. But on the other hand, if it's what you really want to do, stick at it. Because, there'll always be people who want to read books, because the experience of reading a book is something different from film or theatre or whatever. So there's always going to be a market for novels. It's just that maybe it'll be much smaller than it used to be, and it'll be hard to get the attention.
You are also very critical of London, or how the city presents itself. in
Well,
the
I'm
current
very
day.
critical of how the UK is run. I mean, and I'm not playing party politics here. I mean, the entire political class in Britain is a waste of space. That's, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberals, it's a disaster. I mean, I would add that I think Boris Johnson, I'd maintain that Boris Johnson was the worst Prime Minister in British history. I mean, his administration was a particular disgrace. And now we have a Labour government. I didn't have any high hopes for them. They're burning through the goodwill at an extraordinary rate. I've never seen a government lose popularity so quickly. There's a problem with the political class that actually being a politician, if you take the job seriously, is a very tough job. You get attacked all the time. Your family gets attacked all the time by the media. People try and kill you quite often. We've seen, MPs have been murdered, by either individual lunatics or, terrorist organizations. So although I sort of have a sort of general dislike and contempt for politicians, it's a very difficult job and it's an important job. And one of the things I think they should do is pay them more. I mean, this idea that if an MP has a salary which is more than 5 times that of a shop assistant, some crime is being committed, that it's a moral outrage, I think is just stupid. It's an extremely important job, and people should be well paid for it because it's difficult and dangerous and unpleasant, generally speaking. So I don't see anyone in the current parliament who either has the common sense. I mean, there's a complete absence of common sense, just a sort of dissociation from reality that exists in Westminster. Or no, I don't see anyone with the common sense or the spine to do something. Because to actually change things, you have to be quite tough and bold. And they're all sort of little, wet blankets who, probably couldn't organise a barbecue in their back garden. I mean, there are some of the Reform MPs at least are saying some sensible things, but they're a long way from power. But they're capable, I think, of embarrassing the sort of establishment quite well. I mean, I think sometimes maybe it's because I'm getting old and getting grumpy that I find everything very unsatisfactory. But when I go back to London and I talk to people, different ages, different backgrounds, they all say the same thing: nothing works. I mean, it's largely lockdown. I think lockdown destroyed Britain. I would maintain, this is why I particularly hate Boris Johnson and his government. They destroyed the country with lockdown. I mean, fine, the Labour Party were saying, why are you doing this? It was a sort of consensus pretty much in the West. But, certainly in Britain, I mean, I don't know quite why, but Hungary seems to have got through that much better. I mean, maybe Brexit was also a factor in it, that, we were in transition. But just no one wants to work. Everyone wants to work from home. No one's very interested in doing their job. I mean, I can give you sort of endless examples of how the court system, if you're going to wait years for your case to get to court, if you've been raped or assaulted or something. And the national, I mean, I just don't see how even if we had someone very capable, how they could sort it out in the short term. It's a very, I mean, now I have enormous, affection for Britain because, there were, like when my parents arrived in 56, people were extremely kind and helpful. And I grew up there and I have strong affection for the country, but it's just a disaster area now. And, all sorts of small things, Hungary is ahead. I mean, to give you a couple of small examples, if a doctor in Hungary writes you a prescription, whether you're going to see them privately or on the state system, that prescription goes up to the cloud and you can go anywhere in Hungary to any pharmacy and get the prescription. I mean, the best, that I get now from my GP, when I manage to get through to them, of course, which is no easy job, is that it's sent to one local pharmacy, which fine, it's the local pharmacy, so not massively inconvenient. But it would be nice if I was sort of working in London or something, I could have the option of going to a pharmacy there and just picking it up. Similarly, they have a thing called the Kormány Oblak, the government window, which are all over Budapest. And basically any sort of issue you have with tax or social security or whatever, you can go to the government window, as it's called, and they'll try and sort it out for you. And I've used them and they've been quite impressive so far. I mean, to compare it to Britain, I used to have a tax office in London. If I needed to sort something out, it would take me, I don't know, half an hour to get there. I'd probably have to wait 20 minutes, but then I would get to see someone face to face, 10 minutes to sort it out, to get a document stamped or whatever. So 2 hours, I could sort out a tax thing. Then they moved my tax office to somewhere outside of Liverpool. So you'd have to write to them. It would take, I don't know, 10 days or something to get a reply. Last time I needed something done by the tax office, it took them 5 months to reply. You know,
yeah, that's a
I'm not alone in these experiences. So anyway, I really don't know how it can be sorted out. You know, more and more, a military dictatorship starting to look good. You know.
Yeah. You also wrote an article a few years back in defense of Viktor Orban, which was not very well received by the mainstream. Well, no wonder. Many years have passed. I think you still stand for that. So how would you refresh people about the Hungarian government, given they are so misportrayed in the media these days?
Well, I mean, the irony about this is basically the left, largely the former communists, who sort of went around Europe, Brussels and Washington, sort of whispering, "Oh, Mr. Orban, he's an anti-Semite, he's a Nazi, he's a fascist." And the result is of this sort of campaign that, even Pakistani taxi drivers in Los Angeles know who Mr. Orban is. It's his enemies who've created this international figure. I mean, he's probably now, I don't know, the 10th best known politician in the world. So the attempt to smear him has completely backfired on them. And it had no effect inside Hungary because people knew this stuff was completely untrue and ridiculous. But they managed to sucker a lot of the European left and people in the EU. And even some of the Americans. I mean, John McCain, who's not a left-wing politician, described Orban as a fascist because, someone clearly fed him some nonsense. So there's that's one thing. And the other thing is that, of course, in 2015, when he started trying to sort of stop the flow of illegal immigration, everyone was sort of clutching their pearls and swooning and saying how outrageous it is. And guess what? Nearly everyone is following his example because, he saw quite clearly, well, actually, this is a problem and it's not a good idea that, there's unchecked flow of people just walking in. We don't know who they are, etc., etc. He's largely been proved right, certainly on the illegal migration front. The anti-Semite, the Israeli football team plays a lot of their home matches here in Hungary because, they're safe. He's regularly sort of, invited to, I mean, I've seen Israeli politicians, Knesset members, falling over themselves to have a selfie with him. And this was always the case. I mean, people who knew perfectly well this is absolute nonsense. But it's interesting. I mean, the left they really want fascists because it makes them feel, so good about themselves because they can sort of be indignant and fulminate. Well, they're going to have to try and find another target now. And also, again, he called Trump right. He's I think the only sort of senior political figure in Europe who, whatever you think of Trump, saw that Trump was going to win and, is on good terms with Trump. I mean, finally, in the great scheme of things, Hungary doesn't matter very much because it's a small country that most people know nothing about. But he is. I mean, this isn't my opinion. This is a matter of fact, a matter of clear evidence. He is the most successful Hungarian politician of all time, and the only people that come close to him are sort of 19th century aristocrats who were born into power and had an easy time. He came from a very humble background in the countryside. He is genuinely a village boy who came to the big city to study law and has done very well for himself. His performance as prime minister, that's a matter for debate. There are always things that you can criticize and debate. But as a politician, your job is to get power. And I can't think of anyone in Europe who's been as successful in politics as he has. I mean, he would wipe the floor with everyone in Westminster. Yeah. He'd just destroy them almost overnight, because he's essentially very, very good at what he does. And the reason he's been in power for so long is that the Hungarian opposition, generalization, is just very bad at what they do. That's it.
Yeah, and one thing I found very interesting is when I lived in Hungary, I would introduce myself. Like, my name is Vitor, is like Victor, your prime minister, and I just throw that to the table to get people's reaction. I wouldn't tell what is my political orientation, my views. I would just say my name is the same as the prime minister. And some people will say will react with a bad face. Some people will be pleasant to see what happened afterwards. And the funny thing is, for the most part, I was never an object of racism or anything like that. I don't want to play victim. But the funny fact here is the times I was mistreated the most, which were very few, I have to say, was always from people from the left who claimed to be open-minded and welcoming and all that. So, big piece off for these people. It's as the Hungarians say, they preach water and they drink wine.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be said. I think most people, or a lot of people anyway, in Hungary, simply don't care about politics. They have other problems to deal with and don't think about it. I mean, the people who are interested in politics, there is a very vicious divide. I think Hungary pioneered sort of toxic politics long before anyone else. I think that's the other thing that's changed in Britain. One of the best jobs I had was working as a consultant in the early 90s for people who wanted to do business in Hungary. And there was a British MP, Sir Peter Tapsell, who came over with one group. And he went to visit, unsurprisingly, the Hungarian Parliament. And he came back, and this would have been 92, something like that, 93. And he came back and he said to me, they really hate each other, don't they? And he was very surprised about that, because he said that, off stage, behind closed doors, most of the Labour MPs and Conservative MPs actually got on quite well back in Westminster. And I think that's changed. There's always been this really nasty divide. The most common insult in Hungary, in political circles, is traitor, Arulo, or hoza Arulo, which means betraying the country. There's almost zero sort of what you might term adult discussion of politics. It's real mudslinging. And I would say, in my opinion, the communists, the former communists, started it by smearing Orban and calling him an anti-Semite because he was criticizing Soros. There's no sort of temperance in that area at all. And as I say, you've seen it in America, that how nasty it's got. Because let's remember, the Democrats didn't accept Trump's victory the first time around. There was all this stuff about the Russians somehow fixed it. It's not just Trump who was, an election denier. I have a lot of American friends. I spent quite a bit of time in America, and again, it makes me sad to see, the state of American politics. And it's a lot to do with the media. If you go into politics, your life, your family's life, is ruthlessly pulled apart by journalists in a very unnecessary and vicious way. So a lot of people just, don't want to go, quite reasonably, don't want to go into the business.
Especially in the age of internet.
Yeah. But I mean, even without the internet, the sort of tabloid, Michael Gove, for instance, was sort of filmed, in a nightclub on his own after his divorce. I mean, there's no justification for stuff like that. It's just real tabloid filth, as a group, I have a very low opinion of journalists because I've worked in journalism. I know, and a lot of people who write about Hungary do this sort of, Orban's anti-Semitic. And I say, well, would you be kind enough to give me an example of something he's done or something he said? Guess what? They can't come up with anything.
Yeah, for sure he's not as anti-Semitic as Soros. That's for sure. Soros is way more anti-Semitic than him, and he's Jewish.
Anyway, I think Mr. Soros's influence is probably over by now. He spent a lot of money trying to get rid of Victor, and I'm afraid failed. Victor has at least another 2 years. Orban's problem is that in a democracy, people just get tired of you, even if you do a good job. That's the battle he's fighting. Because with the younger generation, I don't think he has much support these days. He looks like what he is. He's a grandfather.
It's hard to appeal, because there's a generation gap. So I think it's hard to appeal.
On the other hand, as I say, Mr. Magyar has done very, very well. He should be congratulated on what he's done so far. But creating it took Orban, I don't know, a decade really to sort of create a sort of proper political party. And, he had some quite intelligent, useful people to work with as well. It's not just him in Fidesz. But, it's a hell of a job creating a political party. And this is the problem that Reform has. A lot of the people who turn up, always people who turn up wanting to be an MP, but there'll be crooks, there'll be, perverts, nutcases. It's very hard to vet people and to create a proper political party. So Mr. Magyar will be a sort of, figure for the next couple of years, but whether they can really get the votes in the end, or whether they'll sort of, blow themselves up, as most of the Hungarian opposition groups have done. No one in the Hungarian opposition, with the exception of Gyurcsány, who I have to credit with extraordinary tenacity, no one in the Hungarian opposition seems to last more than a few years.
So as we come to an end, we are already above 1 hour. I just want to ask you. So I presume you are bilingual in English.
No, my Hungarian. My parents didn't make me keep up the Hungarian, so I sort of had to relearn when I came back. I've given up on the grammar. It's just
it's a very tough language.
The more I think about it, the wronger I am. And I have a British accent. I can't do the double consonants properly. So I know what's going on. I can read very, very slowly, but no, I'm a long way from that.
Would you consider relocating to Hungary full time?
Well, I'm here most of the time. More than half the time I'm here because, as I say, I'm very comfortable and London, as said this many, London now, you either need to be 19. So, full of youthful vigor and you don't mind sleeping on people's floors and so on, or rich. If you're in the middle bracket, it's just really, there are a number of problems. One is the infrastructure. I don't know for sure what the population of London was in the 1970s, and I don't think anyone really knows what the population of London is now. What I can tell you is, having lived there most of my life, is that there are at least 3, if not 4 times more people in London than there were in the 1970s. There's just so many people and the infrastructure cannot cope. In the 70s, you had a rush hour in the morning, rush hour in the evening. The tourists turned up in July and August. The rest of the time, central London, it wasn't deserted or empty, but it was perfectly manageable. everything is just jam-packed. You cannot walk down the pavement in peace anywhere in central London. The tube is always packed, and it makes people very bad-tempered and sort of dyspeptic. People in general in London are not happy, and they're getting more and more unhappy. I mean, the other thing, of course, is everywhere else, prices are going up. I genuinely don't know how most people survive in London. There's nothing. Fine, it's a big city, so there's entertainment and all sorts of things going on. But for most people, it's just, I'd say, impossible to live. Again, I knew people in the sort of 80s and 90s who left London because they wanted to be somewhere else, because they wanted to, become a farmer or something, or live in the countryside. It's only in the last 10 years I've known professional people, journalists, others, people with nice middle-class jobs who have left London simply because they cannot afford to live there.
Yeah, that's sad. If it's not their decision, it's beyond their preferences. That's very, very, very sad. Yeah, it's same happened here in Ireland. So look, thanks for the chat. I think we touched base in a good few items here. We could spend maybe another hour, but maybe we can schedule another session. I don't know, sometime in the future.
You've had my best anecdotes, I think.
It was great. So look, I want to wish you the best. Enjoy your time there in Budapest. I think it's a very cool place to be in December. The lighting, the atmosphere,
cold, not cool.
But cold, yeah, but cold. But heating system is great there. I remember that. I like it because you guys have gas. It's very different than here in Ireland or the UK. So
Hungarians always look after themselves very well. Heating, food, comfort. Hungarians are very keen on comfort.
Yeah, and that's vital. So thanks, Tibor, and wish you all the best. And we'll keep in touch.
Okay. Merry Christmas to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.